Hello and welcome. My name is Jonathan Corrado to this program, The General versus the President, MacArthur and Truman at the Brink of Nuclear War. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Henry Brandts, who is a scholar of American history who has published 30 books, including the topic of today's discussion, The General versus the President, MacArthur and Truman at the Brink of Nuclear War. I've got my copy right here. I encourage you to go out and get it. It's a great book. Professor Brandts examines politics and foreign policy, business and economics, society and culture. Currently, he is the Jack S. Blanton Sr. Chair in History at the University of Texas. Professor Brandts, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Delighted to be with you, Jonathan.
So maybe we could start with just a very basic narrative for our viewers who are coming to this program with varying levels of knowledge about the Korean War. So perhaps it might be helpful to just talk a little bit, a basic narrative of what were the causes and what was the general orientation of the war.
Sure. At the end of World War II in the Pacific, Korea was divided temporarily, it was thought, for the convenience of accepting the surrender of Japanese troops who were in Korea at the time. And the United States took the southern part of Korea and accepted the surrender of Japanese troops there. Soviet troops who entered from the north took the surrender of the Japanese troops in the north. It was assumed that this temporary division of the country would be temporary, just as it was assumed that a contemporaneous division of Germany would be temporary. But disputes developed between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the temporary division of Germany became permanent, more or less, and the temporary division of Korea became increasingly permanent. And a communist regime emerged in the Soviet zone, the northern part of Korea, and an anti-communist, a non-communist regime emerged in the south. The regime in the south was more or less protected by American troops, the regime in the north by Soviet troops. But by the end of the 1940s, it looked as though the foreign protector troops weren't necessary. The United States pulled its troops out of southern Korea, I should call it southern Korea, and the Soviets pulled their troops out of northern Korea, leaving these two essentially hostile regimes in power. Each one, the North Korean regime under Kim Il-sung, looking toward the Soviet Union for support, and after China became communist, looking toward China as well. The regime in southern Korea, led by Syngman Rhee, looked to the United States. But the idea was that Korea was probably not going to be a battleground, and so the two great powers pulled their troops out. Then, to the surprise of the United States government, although less to the surprise of the Soviet Union, communist forces of North Korea attacked across the dividing line, the 38th parallel, and moved south, on the grounds that their government was actually the government of all of Korea. At the same time, the government of the southern part of Korea, of the Republic of Korea, claimed that it was the government of all of Korea. And so fighting emerged in June of 1950. This took the United States government quite by surprise. And the president of the United States, Harry Truman, had to decide how to respond. In fact, as he was deciding how to respond, that is the United States commander in East Asia, Douglas MacArthur, had already made a decision that he was going to send troops from where he was located in Japan to resist the invasion of southern Korea. And so MacArthur faced essentially this fait accompli, with which he didn't disagree. And so the United States went to war on behalf of South Korea, of the Republic of Korea. But I'll use the term South Korea because that was in colloquial usage. It was important, but just accidental almost, that the United States' support of South Korea received the support of the United Nations as well. The Soviet delegate to the United Nations was boycotting meetings of the Security Council because the United States and American allies in the Security Council refused to recognize the new communist government of China. And so the Soviet delegate was not there to veto a measure by the Security Council saying that members of the United Nations are invited, encouraged to go to the defense of South Korea. And so the defense of South Korea was both a United States operation and a United Nations operation, and of course, an operation by Republic of Korea troops. So that's how the fighting began. And then it went back and forth over the space of basically 3 years before it ended in an armistice in the summer of 1953. So that sort of sets the historical scene.
Fantastic overview. And I like how you mentioned that really eyes prior to Kim Il-sung's invasion, eyes in America were really trained on Europe. And a lot of Truman's administration were so-called Atlanticists, especially Secretary of State Dean Acheson, really focused on Europe, thinking that the Soviet Union's play was going to happen there. And Korea, such a surprise. And even after the fighting breaks out, there's still a focus on the Soviet Union's role and making sure that we don't devote too many troops to the theater in Korea, such that we couldn't respond to a contingency in Europe. So much of the story is about that distraction. So thanks for bringing that up. And you describe all this really well in your book. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of this discussion, which is really about these two larger than life characters. As you described, this was not your typical relationship between a commander-in-chief and his commander in the field. Your book does a great job characterizing the strengths and weaknesses of MacArthur and Truman, and it portrays the power dynamics between them, how that evolved over time. So let's start at the beginning. What were the factors shaping the relationship between Truman and MacArthur in the run-up to Kim Il-sung's invasion?
To start with MacArthur, who is in fact the more impressive individual in the minds of most Americans, the more accomplished individual in the minds of most Americans, even after Harry Truman became president of the United States. Douglas MacArthur was the son of a famous Civil War general, the boy hero of the Civil War, who received the Medal of Honor at the age of 18 or something like that. And MacArthur grew up in the military. He had been educated for a military career. He was repeatedly decorated veteran hero of World War I. He had advanced through the ranks. He had become chief of staff of the Army. And then in what amounted to sort of a sideways, a lateral promotion, he became the commanding general, the field marshal of the Philippine Army, as the Philippine Army was developing in preparation for Philippine independence. A reminder to the audience, the United States annexed the Philippines as a colony after the Spanish-American War. So from 1899 until 1946, the Philippines was an American colony, and therefore the United States had the responsibility to defend the Philippines. The responsibility became greater and more burdensome during the first first 4 decades of the 20th century as the imperial ambitions of Japan grew. And so when the Philippines was promised independence by U.S. Congress in the mid-1930s, then the Philippines needed to develop their own army, and they decided to hire MacArthur. And they brought MacArthur into the Philippines, and MacArthur went to the Philippines in the mid-1930s, and he remained there. He became, well, wherever MacArthur was, he was always sort of a larger-than-life character. He tended to speak of himself in the third person, with an imperial sort of attitude. He was very good at holding himself aloof, and so he didn't get friendly with reporters. He would smoke his pipe, hold his pipe, and he would pronounce to reporters. But he was very much unlike other generals of the time, with which he is often compared. So Dwight Eisenhower was this Kansas boy who had a big smile, and he certainly took pains to give the impression that he didn't think any more of himself than anybody else. But MacArthur was just the opposite. MacArthur had this headquarters on the top floor of the Manila Hotel in downtown Manila. And anyway, so he was in the Philippines when World War II broke out. He never came back to the United States, and he became the commander, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific during the Pacific War. And he, by no means single-handedly, although MacArthur often spoke that way, the Allied forces defeated Japan. And MacArthur, now this is almost literally true, almost single-handedly invaded Japan. He made a point. MacArthur was big on the psychology of leadership and the psychology of victory. And so after the Japanese surrender, I mean, after the Japanese announced they were going to surrender, MacArthur insisted on going to Japan unarmed and unaccompanied. And his advisors all said, this is absolutely crazy. There are assassins there. There are people who are going to kill you. He said, no, no, this is going to be far more effective. If I went with the whole battalion of troops, that wouldn't be impressive. If I go alone and unarmed, then it will really make an impression on the Japanese. They will know they have lost. And so MacArthur then set about doing perhaps the most remarkable thing ever done by any American official overseas. Again, almost single-handedly, I exaggerate only a little here, he remade Japan. He headed the occupation, the U.S. military occupation of Japan, but it was under his leadership that Japan was converted from this military, almost feudal dictatorship to this liberal democracy. And the Japanese accepted this constitution that MacArthur essentially wrote for them. And Japan, which had been the most feared power in the Pacific for 50 years, all of a sudden, and ever since, has become this model citizen of a modern world community. And so MacArthur, as I say, he was not disinclined to think well of himself, but this made him really think that. So that's Douglas MacArthur, and he's riding high in 1950. He's in command, almost in sole command of the American occupation of Japan. Who is Harry Truman? Well, Harry Truman was somebody that nobody had heard of before about 1940 or so, a senator from Missouri. He had become senator largely with the support of the corrupt Pendergast political machine of Kansas City, but he seemed to be largely honest himself. He made a minor name during World War II in checking up to see that defense contractors weren't taking money and putting it in their pockets. So government oversight committee, that was pretty good. And then, to the surprise of just about everybody, he was added to the Franklin Roosevelt ticket in 1944 because other members of the party didn't want Henry Wallace to become president should Franklin Roosevelt die. And then Franklin Roosevelt dies, and all of a sudden, Harry Truman, this nobody, is president of the United States. And Harry Truman was not someone who made a big splash. His first reaction was, when he became president, he said he felt as though the sky, the stars, and the moon had fallen in on him. He thought the job was too big for him. But he gradually grew into the job. But still, in 1950, really when our story opens, Harry Truman, in the minds of most Americans, is distinctly inferior in all the important ways to Douglas MacArthur. And especially when you're talking about matters of war and peace. Harry Truman knows nothing about war. He was a captain of artillery during World War I. Douglas MacArthur was a five-star general, and he was the most powerful, with the possible exception of Dwight Eisenhower, another five-star general. These were the two guys. But MacArthur, if you wanted to know what to do in the event of war, who are you going to listen to? Harry Truman or Douglas MacArthur? Most Americans say, well, Douglas MacArthur, of course.
That's a fantastic foundation that you've set up, and it's going to give us some good orientation later on. The basis for their disagreement is going to happen over China. So I think it's good to ask about this early on. So from the very beginning, MacArthur and Truman's administration viewed China very differently. Truman sought to separate the question of Taiwan from the Korea conflict entirely and wanted to avoid inviting China to the fight. He was very frustrated comparatively by MacArthur's stiff and public support for Chiang Kai-shek and appetite to collide with communist China. So how do you think these views on China colored their respective opinion on just what was happening in the Korean War?
The fundamental difference they had on China, which you aptly described, is at the heart of the difference that emerges between the president and the general. And it has everything to do with the fact that Truman himself had very little knowledge of the world beyond Missouri or the United States. But he did surround himself with apt advisors. They were people who knew the world. But they leaned, as you suggested earlier, they leaned in an Atlanticist direction. They were East Coasters. And if you're on the East Coast, you look to Europe. And so, and this was actually following in the footsteps of Franklin Roosevelt, who was advised by George Marshall. During World War II, at the beginning of World War II, which for the United States began in the Pacific, nonetheless, the United States concluded that Europe was more important in the balance of power than Japan and the Pacific were. And the thinking was that it's Europe where all the industrial capacity, for example, that we're fighting against is centered in Germany. Whoever controls the European heartland is going to be the bigger problem. Japan is a problem, to be sure, but Japan was a relatively small country, a relatively poor country, even when World War II began. It's a big deal at the moment because its Navy has expanded its power a long way. But in the greater scheme of things, Europe is where the peace of the world will be won or lost, where democracy will be won or lost. That was the decision made in World War II. And Harry Truman inherited that. And so American thinking after World War II, as the Cold War developed with the Soviet Union, focused on European theater. And it was all about how is Europe going to be divided? How is Europe going to be defended? And it was at the beginning of 1949, just a little bit over 1 year before fighting breaks out in Korea, that the United States sponsored the creation of NATO. Now, this was the United States' first peacetime alliance in 150 years. And the American government, and especially the American people, are trying to adjust to what does this mean? It's a peacetime alliance, but it's a military alliance. Does it mean we're going to go to war against the Soviet Union? And in the thinking and hope of the Truman administration, no, that wasn't the case, but it was always a possibility. And everybody thought that if a war broke out with the Soviet Union, it would be like World War II in Europe. The fighting would take place in Europe. So in the thinking of Truman and most of his advisors, Europe is the ground zero. It's the epicenter of the Cold War. That's where the Cold War will be won or lost. Not so for Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had a chronic case of what in the military they call theateritis, the belief that whatever theater you are in is the central theater of whatever conflict you happen to be in. And MacArthur, of course, he had thought that the Pacific theater, his theater of World War II, was the central theater of the war. And he thought in the Cold War, his theater of the Cold War was the central theater of the Cold War. Now, this became more plausible in 1949 when the Communist People's Liberation Army, PLA, and Mao Zedong took control of China, because now all of a sudden China, which had been an ally of the United States during World War II, basically flipped sides. And now it's an ally of the Soviet Union. And so MacArthur had reason to believe that, especially with this change of events in China, and you sort of asked about the centrality of China, that really the center of gravity of communism in the world now is not Europe, it's in Asia. And that's where things will be fought. There's one other aspect to this, and it's a personality kind of thing. And maybe it's an occupational thing. The president of the United States, Harry Truman, gravitated toward peace. He thought in terms of how do we keep the peace? How do we prevent war from happening? MacArthur was a general, and MacArthur thought in terms of war. And so, in fact, everybody worried about if and when is World War III going to begin? Because in their lifetimes, both of them, Truman and MacArthur, had experienced World War I, World War II. And once you start, putting numbers after these, World War I, World War II, World War III, that obviously comes next. And a whole lot of people thought, well, as the Cold War is emerging, that's going to happen. And it's going to happen soon. The question was, where is it going to start?
Right.
And most of Truman's advisors said, if it's going to start, it's going to start in Europe. Douglas MacArthur said, if it's going to start in Asia. And the North Korean attack on South Korea, he interpreted as the beginning of World War III. And this is the fundamental difference between Truman and MacArthur. Truman thinks the Korean War needs to be contained. Otherwise, it might blow up into World War III. MacArthur says World War III has already begun. And MacArthur was one who famously said, in war, there is no substitute for victory.
I think this is a great point, a really important one. And I recall seeing a CIA analysis prior to the Korean War that was listing potential hotspots where we could see conflict sometime soon. And, there was Greece and Turkey and Iran and Germany even, and Korea was like number 5 or 6 on their list of places where potentially something could pop off. So just not on their radar at all.
Well, in fact, the U.S. State Department had sort of thought through all of this. They game planned this stuff, and they had acknowledged that fighting might break out on the Korean Peninsula. But they took the position after U.S. troops evacuated Korea in the end of 1949, that this isn't our problem. We've got other problems we're going to have to deal with. And so Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, gave a widely noticed speech to the National Press Club in early 1950, in which he defined what the American security perimeter was, the American defense perimeter. And in the Pacific, it went down the so-called offshore island chain. So the Aleutians, Japan, Taiwan, or Formosa, it was often called, and the Philippines. And it conspicuously excluded Korea. And so if something happened in Korea, the thinking was, okay, the Koreans are going to deal with it themselves. Things changed, though, because just about the time that Acheson gave that speech, Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, launched his virulent attack on the Truman administration for being soft on communism. And the allegation was that the Truman administration was infiltrated with communists and that Truman had allowed China to fall to the communists. And so it really got Truman sort of backpedaling politically to the point where Truman was inclined to say, you know, we can't let more territory be lost to communism. So his initial reflex was, okay, we've got to go defend South Korea. But this set a precedent that nobody really understood the significance of at the moment. Truman sent American troops to war without a declaration of war. Nobody knew it at the time, but there never would be, at least until now, another American declaration of war. What has happened is, because of Truman's decision, which is motivated in part by the suddenness of events, the surprise of the events in Korea, but also by a recognition that in the nuclear age, there might not be time to bring Congress there and to gear up for a war. The American model had always been, in peacetime, we disband the army. We go to war, then we build up the army and we go fight. But in the Cold War era, in the nuclear era, we have to be ready to go right away. And when Truman got away with basically declaring war on his own, and Congress didn't call him on it, then other presidents, subsequent presidents, took the lesson, okay, basically, I'm the one who makes these decisions for war or peace. And that's been the norm ever since. I might just add sort of also connections to the present. So the United States is involved in supporting Ukraine in its defense against invading Russian troops. There are plenty of people who say, well, that's all well and good, but the real challenge for American security in the future is going to be China. So we don't want to get bogged down in Europe when something might happen in China. And so there's long been, and there still is, this sort of two theaters aspect to where does American security really lie. Today, there's more of an emphasis that the bigger threat is in East Asia, the Pacific, China's relationship with Taiwan, and so on. In 1950, the balance was in the other direction. But there still is this recognition that the United States might find itself fighting this two-front war.
And it's ironic that Korea is known as the Forgotten War, considering how many modern policy implications there are, how many precedents were set at this time. As you mentioned, not declaring war and sending troops overseas to fight in a war. The logic of the Cold War was set, the whole pattern was set in the Korean War, domino theory, the principle of a satellite war. These were not anticipated, but then became replicated endlessly. That was one of the major reasons that America predicted that China would not enter the war, was because they thought that the Soviet Union would restrain them for fear of outbreak and escalation of World War III. So all these things, which then became like common sense, yeah, everybody knows that, was totally and completely new for them. So we have to be really honest with ourselves. Looking before these things emerged, it would be difficult to anticipate.
Exactly. And another irony of the fact that the Korean War is often overlooked is that the Korean War actually was one of the great success stories for American Cold War policy.
Absolutely.
Because we'll get to what happens between Truman and MacArthur, I presume, but the outcome was the United States did what it set out to do, to defend South Korea against communist attack. And furthermore, South Korea took a while, but South Korea emerged into this sort of model national citizen in East Asia. And that was, of course, the hope that under the aegis of American protection, countries would develop and emerge as democracies. And and strong points for a modern sort of liberal approach to the world. And South Korea is kind of exhibit A in that.
Yep.
But it certainly is forgotten. It's forgotten for two reasons. One is that at the time, it was an unsatisfactory repetition of World War II. It was unsatisfactory while it was being fought because it was a limited war. And, it's World War II. The great thing about World War II is we go all out and we win. And with Korea, because of the restrictions that geopolitics and American policy placed on it, it wasn't an all-out war because the two administrations responsible, the Truman and the Eisenhower administration, did not think it was worth an all-out war in a nuclear era. So it was that way. And the other thing was, because of that, it didn't turn out as a clear victory. And so it was a smaller version and less satisfactory version of the war that came before. And then the war that came after, the Vietnam War, well, that was the war of the baby boom generation. And that was the war that went on longer. And so there are a whole lot more American veterans of Vietnam than of Korea. And even though the Vietnam War turned out to be a defeat for the United States, and that was a lot worse. In fact, when Lyndon Johnson was in Congress, was in government during the Korean War, and he saw how a Korean War could end, how the Korean War did end. It ended in this stalemate, which compared to the victory, the clear-cut victory in World War II, was unsatisfactory. But Johnson, of course, was president during Vietnam. And Johnson discovered, wait a minute, there's a lot worse than a stalemate in a war in East Asia. We could actually lose it. So Johnson would have been delighted at any time from 1964 forward to accept a Korean solution to the war in Vietnam, but he didn't get it.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we're ready to enter into the war itself.
Yeah.
So let's start with Kim Il-sung's invasion. How do they both respond? And then we could even go into MacArthur's Incheon landing. So over to you, Professor Brands.
So the fact is that the North Korean, the communist invasion of South Korea, took the United States, it took the Republic of Korea forces by surprise. They weren't ready. They weren't expecting it. And it succeeded very rapidly. It succeeded rapidly in forcing South Korean, Republic of Korean forces to retreat. And many, many civilians evacuated Seoul, and everybody sort of fled south, away from the communist forces. And it looked for about the first 2 weeks of the war as though this was going to be a complete success for the communist forces. They were going to drive the ROK forces off the peninsula. They were going to prevent the Americans from digging in. And Kim Il-sung would be the leader of all of Korea. And there'd be a great victory. Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces from Tokyo, sent U.S. forces as fast as he could to the southern part of Korea. They established a beachhead on the southern part of the peninsula, and they dug in. And MacArthur basically gave the order, no, we're not retreating here. You're going to stand and fight. And they managed to hold a perimeter around the southern part of the peninsula. And at that point, the war seemed as though, well, what happened again and again during the war, the front stuck. So there had been rapid motion for a couple of 3 weeks, and then the fighting, the two sides dig in, and it seems to be stuck. At which point, and this lasted through most of the summer of 1950. And the question then for the United States, and I'll say United States, but also I have to say United Nations, because Douglas MacArthur was both the U.S. commander and the United Nations commander. And the Truman administration, for good political reasons, took pains to portray this as a UN operation, because from the perspective of the United States, this was the world defending South Korea against aggression from another country. Now, this is where it does get a little bit dicey, because this whole business of United Nations, UN, it's supposed to deal with invasions across international boundaries. But the 38th parallel wasn't an international boundary. So it's really a civil war that's going on in Korea. But from the American perspective, and which was adopted by the United Nations, this is in essence an international war. So there was this de facto permanence given to this temporary boundary drawn back in 1945. So anyway, so MacArthur says, okay, what can we do here? He's got a mandate from his own government and from the United Nations to drive communist forces out of South Korea. And he hatches a plan that was so dangerous, so reckless, that his own Joint Chiefs of Staff. So MacArthur nominally took orders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are the top military board. But in fact, Eisenhower personally outranked every member on the Joint Chiefs, and he knew it. And so, in fact, when I was doing the research of the book, when I was reading I'm not even going to call them orders because they weren't really orders. They were letters. They were missives sent from the Joint Chiefs to MacArthur. And they never say, you are ordered to do this. They say, we think it would be wise for you to do this or that. And eventually, somebody saw this, another general, in fact, who'd worked with MacArthur, who came on to the Joint Chiefs, and he said, well, why don't you just tell MacArthur what to do? Why don't you just give him orders? And they said, well, because he might disobey the orders. And then what would we do?
Right.
Because in a certain way, they were all intimidated by MacArthur. They didn't have the experience. They didn't have all the decorations he had. They didn't have the stars he had. They didn't have the popular support he had. And for Harry Truman, this was crucial because if there had been a public opinion poll made in 1950, who's more popular, Harry Truman or Douglas MacArthur? MacArthur would have won in a runaway. But, and contributing to this is the fact that MacArthur had already run for president in 1940. And actually, he sort of half-heartedly ran for president in 1944. And he ran again in 1948. And everybody understood he was going to run in 1952. So this popularity is a big deal. MacArthur was the most politicized general of his generation in American politics. American soldiers, American generals, commanding officers have long prided themselves on their apolitical nature because they say we serve under presidents who are Republicans, presidents who are Democrats, and it doesn't make any difference. MacArthur wasn't that way. It's really clear he was a Republican, and it was really clear he had political ambitions. So MacArthur is thinking of this grand plan that is going to seize the initiative. And the Joint Chiefs say, boy, this isn't going to work. But they said, okay, basically they were going to give MacArthur enough rope to hang himself. And so he envisioned this end run around the North Korean lines, and the landing at Incheon, which was behind their lines, but it was going to be really difficult because the tide in Incheon Bay is such that the window when you can actually bring landing craft up to shore is very short. It's just a couple of hours. And if you're too early or too late, the ships get mired miles offshore in the mudflats. And the Joint Chiefs and the intelligence people said, this is too dangerous. There's no way this is going to work. But MacArthur said, that's the reason it's going to work, because the communists know that it's so dangerous, nobody in his right mind would ever do it, so they're not going to be prepared for it. So MacArthur rolled the dice. He wouldn't have said he rolled the dice. He took advantage of the opportunity, and it succeeded brilliantly. It succeeded so brilliantly, in fact, that MacArthur came within a whisker of enveloping the entire North Korean army. But the North Korean army, as soon as they realized that he'd gotten behind their lines, they all just fled for the north. They fled for their lives up the north. And MacArthur sent his troops, U.S. troops, South Korean troops, and other UN troops in pursuit of the communists as they head north. At which point, Harry Truman has to make a decision. The original UN mandate was clear South Korea of communist invaders. Well, that had been done. But MacArthur points out, if we stop at the dividing line between North and South, then they'll just regroup in the North, and eventually, we'll go home and they'll do it again. So here's our chance. We can actually destroy the whole army. We can take North Korea. We can liberate North Korea. And when he tells this to Harry Truman, now it's not face-to-face because they don't meet until just one time during this war. Harry Truman's starting to think, man, the Republicans in Congress are beating up on me for losing ground to the communists. What if I do something no president has ever done? I'm going to win ground back from the communists. So he says to MacArthur, go ahead, you go. And this is where MacArthur assures Truman once, twice, again and again, I can do it. I can take North Korea. And so they head off into North Korea. And it looks as though, in fact, MacArthur makes boasts that, this is by now the fall of 1950. And he says, war is going to be over by Christmas. The troops are going to be home. This is the last phase of the war, just mopping up operations. Well, it's during this time that China, acting through intermediaries, primarily India, drops strong hints that China is not going to sit idly by while U.S. troops approach the North Korean-Chinese border. And they made specific, it was U.S. troops they were concerned about. They didn't care about troops of South Korea, the Republic of Korea troops, because that was Korea. But they were really worried about U.S. troops getting close to Chinese territory. And this because the United States government, President MacArthur, everybody else, they refused to accept the Chinese communist victory. They were still saying that the government on Taiwan, or Formosa as it's still often called, was the government of China, the government of Chiang Kai-shek. And there were people in the United States, Republicans mostly, but they were assisted by Douglas MacArthur, who said that far from sort of ending the war in China, it would be to the advantage of the United States to reopen the Chinese Civil War, the war between Mao Zedong and the communists and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, the Kuomintang. And so, and Chiang Kai-shek is agitating, let me go back to China. I want to reopen the war. And so MacArthur's in this position where he is subtly encouraging Chiang Kai-shek to think, yeah, we're going to help you go to war. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek is saying, hey, I'll send tens of thousands of Chinese nationalist troops to fight in the Korean War. And Truman says, no, because the China position of the Truman administration is, we don't want to let Chiang Kai-shek reopen hostilities because we will be seen as responsible for him. And we don't want to go to war against China because, first of all, we don't want to go to war against China. But secondly, China now has this military alliance with the Soviet Union. And by this time, the Soviet Union had atom bombs. And so this is what escalated the whole thing. There was a belief, which was not implausible at the time, when Mao Zedong is recently in charge of China and Stalin is still alive in the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists didn't much respect Russia generally, but they all respected Stalin. Stalin was the man of steel. He was the one who had defeated the Germans. And so in the pecking order of the communist hierarchy, Mao Zedong looked up to Stalin. And so when American leaders spoke of this monolithic communism, I mean, basically what they were saying is that communist China is not going to do anything without the okay of the communist Soviet Union. And that was a reasonable approximation in 1950, 1951. Later, in the 1960s, it would change, but largely that reflected the fact that Stalin died. And after Stalin died, the leaders who came along after Stalin in the Soviet Union were not anywhere near as impressive. And Mao Zedong began to think, I'm the one who really speaks for world communism. So Americans were really worried that if they got too deeply into a war against China, it would lead to a war against the Soviet Union. And that was the background concern of everything that Truman did regarding the war.
Excellent job. And so MacArthur advocating for the use of those nationalist troops in the Korean War, Truman saying, no, that what a terrible escalation that would be. The State Department, which often MacArthur viewed as his enemy, considering why don't we think about sending only South Korean troops north of the 38th parallel and take this bluff seriously, take this threat seriously. Of course, roundly throughout the administration, even Truman himself, the October 3rd Zhou Enlai threat was viewed as a bluff, unfortunately, because it was true. But I think we're set up and we're ready to go to one of my favorite episodes from the book and one of my favorite episodes from history, which is Wake Island.
Oh yes, the meeting in Wake Island.
So bring me to Wake Island.
Yeah, so the fact that there is even a meeting at Wake Island was a huge concession on the part of Harry Truman to the ego of Douglas MacArthur, because commanders-in-chief do not pay visits to the theater commanders. It's the other way around. The theater commanders, they go to where the commander-in-chief is, because, of course, the president of the United States has lots to do besides dealing with the Korean War. And so the president's time is more valuable than the time of general, even a general as full of himself as Douglas MacArthur. But MacArthur and Truman repeatedly said, please, can you, I mean, he didn't say it directly, through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, come to Washington, brief us on the war. And MacArthur always said, no, I'm too busy here. I'm needed here. Now, one of the ironic things about MacArthur being needed in vicinity of the Korean War, MacArthur conducted the entire Korean War from Japan. He did not spend one night in theater on the ground in Korea. And this is something that created a lot of resentment against MacArthur on the part of the troops who were in Korea. And just as an aside here, while I was writing the book, I encountered, and after I wrote the book, I encountered a lot of people who had fought in U.S. veterans who had fought in Korea. And to a person, they all despised Douglas MacArthur.
Wow.
And it's striking because American generals have generally wanted to portray themselves as a GI's general. So, I mean, this goes back to the Civil War when George McClellan was beloved of his troops because he always looked after his troops. He wasn't much of a leader. He didn't make good decisions. But in the days of MacArthur, it was Dwight Eisenhower who was the GI's general. He was the one who mingled with the troops ahead of the battle. You know, he made sure that he shared their deprivations and all this stuff. Not MacArthur. MacArthur was aloof. MacArthur also had this habit of showing up at the moment of victory after some battle or campaign and basically telling the reporters, yeah, I did it all myself. And, you know, by omission, dissing the troops who actually did it. So there was no love lost for MacArthur. But anyway, MacArthur kept saying that he was too busy to come see the president. So Truman realizes that he does have to talk to MacArthur because this is a critical moment in decision-making for this war. So Truman makes the long trek, and it was way longer in those days before jet airplane travel, and travels halfway around the world to Wake Island to meet Douglas MacArthur, who just has a short hop from Tokyo. And wouldn't you know it, Truman flies all that way, and MacArthur is going to make him wait. So MacArthur, when Truman's plane is coming in, Truman says to his pilot, oh, he's radio ahead and find out if MacArthur's on the ground yet. And MacArthur wasn't on the ground yet. And Truman says, well, just circle. I'm not going to wait on him. He's going to wait on me. So there was that kind of personality, that kind of headbutting. But one of the reasons Truman went, and Truman was a slyer politician than most people recognize, and then MacArthur himself recognized. So what Truman wanted to get out of this meeting at Wake Island, he wanted to get MacArthur on record as saying what MacArthur did. And so the question was, do we take these Chinese warnings seriously? These warnings that China will intervene if U.S. troops get too close. And Truman asks once, and then he asks again. Now, a little bit of background here. There is not a note taker. There's not an official note taker at the meeting. But Truman has arranged, it makes it sound accidental, but it wasn't accidental at all. Truman has arranged for one of the stenographers who was they were going to put together a communique that they were to agree on and then give at the end of the meeting. Well, she is kind of underemployed at the moment, and she thought, maybe I'll just go for a walk on the beach. Well, the soldier said, no, you can't go for a walk on the beach. So she just sits down in this room that is right next to the room where the meeting is taking place. And she can hear all the voices. And she said, for her side of the story, and for Truman's side of the story, well, I just did what I naturally did. I just got a pen and just started transcribing. And so she got it on the record that MacArthur said, the Chinese will not enter the war. Oh, but then he sort of qualifies a little bit and he says, and if they do, I will destroy them.
Yeah.
So that's what Truman got out of this meeting. That's what he needed, because he's already thinking, I got a problem with MacArthur. But if I've got MacArthur on the record as saying the Chinese will not intervene, and if they do, I will destroy them, that at least it provides him some cover. Now, of course, he is president of the United States. He's commander in chief. So it's ultimately his responsibility. But he was in no position at that point to overrule, to say, I know better than Douglas MacArthur.
Yeah.
So go ahead. And so the troops go up to the border, they get close to the border, and the Chinese do indeed intervene. Now, this is where there's a serious, well, objectively speaking, there's a serious lapse in MacArthur's intelligence. And this is both intelligent in the sense of information coming in and just his common sense. Because he keeps getting reports from the front that there's evidence, oh, we took some prisoners and some of them are Chinese. And what are they doing here? And so he should have been aware of this. He should have been at least prepared for the likelihood, but he wasn't. Now, quite possibly, it was simply MacArthur's ego at work. But there's another possibility here, that at least there's another influence that was at least partly at work. I mentioned earlier that MacArthur really thought that this was the beginning of World War III. So MacArthur wanted to take on the Chinese. Now, he couldn't say that to the president of the United States and wake up. He couldn't say, bring them on, because then it would be very clear that his policy differed from that of Truman. And Truman might very well have said, okay, I'm going to replace you with somebody else who's more in line with my thinking. Because MacArthur wanted to be there when this happened, because MacArthur could imagine. So again, this is MacArthur. MacArthur resented the fact that Dwight Eisenhower was receiving more credit for winning World War II than he was. But now, if this is World War III, Eisenhower is just going to be stuck there in Europe. Eisenhower was the head of NATO at the time. Nothing's going on in Europe, but this is where World War III is beginning. It's going to be me. So later, when MacArthur was trying to explain away the fact that he had been taken by surprise, because it certainly looked like a surprise, MacArthur said, no. I set a trap. Right. And I drew them in so we could take them on. Force. And then, because what MacArthur was thinking, now either before or after the fact, it's a little bit hard because, of course, his explanations are somewhat self-serving, as all our explanations are. Once he is fighting Chinese troops, then he can make the case, okay, we're at war with China. Now act like we're at war with China. Right. And we're not going to fight a war against China entirely in Korea. We're going to take the war to China itself. Now, the counter to that was, well, yeah, but that'll bring the Soviet Union into the war. Now, MacArthur never said this, but it's certainly logical to believe that he would say, well, yeah, bring them on, because this is World War III, and we're going to have to deal with it better now than later. Now, there's something here that MacArthur didn't realize. And in fact, almost nobody realized at the time. So we can reconstruct MacArthur's thinking, because I guess this isn't going to spoil the ending for the audience, but MacArthur's going to get fired. And after he's fired, there are congressional investigations, mostly pointing the finger of blame at Truman. You know, why did you fire this great guy? They're sponsored by the Republicans. And so MacArthur goes and he gets to tell his story at great length. And MacArthur was an eloquent spokesman for his point of view. And when MacArthur gave a speech, so in fact, when he came back to the United States, he was invited to speak before a joint session of Congress. And he gave this speech that was, my gosh, it is just a masterpiece of sort of military political oratory, where he had this joint session of Congress. It was one of the first speeches that was televised, but it was also carried by the radio networks. And he had the audience cheering when they were supposed to be cheering. They had him weeping when they were supposed to be weeping. And he ended with this, it sounds a bit melodramatic, but it really worked at the time, when he said, I remember that old barracks room ballad that says, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. Now, the irony of that was MacArthur had no intention of fading away. He was using that speech to launch his campaign for the Republican nomination for president in 1952. So it was still a few years away, but still. Anyway, so this is how we explain how MacArthur allowed his troops to be attacked by the Chinese troops. Certainly the number that came in surprised him. The fact that they infiltrated so fully behind American lines, behind Korean lines, surprised him. So I think he would have much preferred that China come in a way that he could deal with more successfully. So he was in a he was in really sad shape. There was a period of 3 or 4 days where he wasn't even answering messages from the Joint Chiefs. And there were some people in Washington, and Eisenhower himself thought that maybe MacArthur has finally lost it. But then he did pull out, and he has to deal with it from there. And this is, all of a sudden, the Korean War is a much bigger deal than Korea.
Yep.
And so now it is potentially, or actually in MacArthur's thinking, a precursor to World War III. Because now, for the only time, the United States in the Cold War is fighting a communist major power. The United States fought North Korea, small power, North Vietnam. But China's a big power. It wasn't,
Right.
Didn't have nuclear weapons or anything then, but it had a whole lot of soldiers.
So that was all fantastic. I want to make one point and then go on to my next question. So I'd also submit that one other reason that MacArthur flubbed the intelligence was that it was willful suppression. He has this permission from the Joint Chiefs, proceed up north of the 38th as long as the Chinese don't intervene or there's no threat thereof of the intervention. And so by admitting that, he would shorten his own leash by the Joint Chiefs, and he was in no mood to do so. And so his intelligence chief, Willoughby, was just willing to do whatever MacArthur asked and acted to really suppress information, that including this prisoner of war testimony. It's astounding. They would make reactions like, it's impossible for a prisoner of war who is a private in the PLA to have this type of sophisticated knowledge about the larger unit that he is in. They don't have that kind of information. We were getting it. We knew how many there were. But it was just willfully ignored. So I just wanted to make that point. But in terms of one big thing, and you've talked about this a lot, but public sentiment, public support, such a big part of the way that these two leaders were positioning themselves. So in October, before China's large intervention, 64% of Americans were in favor of taking all of Korea, right? Things were going well, everything, as you were describing very well. 2 months later, after China intervenes and the tide turns, 66% of Americans wanted to abandon Korea altogether. So big shift here. So, okay, Truman and MacArthur, how are they different in their approaches to now the prospect of World War III has arrived on our doorstep? What are we going to do about it? What are these two leaders? How do they differ in their preferred approach?
So as I've suggested, MacArthur welcomed, finally, direct hostilities with China. In part, it was a personal thing. He was the guy. He was the general. He was going to lead the United States to victory. And there was no doubt in MacArthur's mind that if this became World War III, the United States would win. And he would defeat China. And if the Soviet Union sent troops, he would defeat the Soviet troops. Now, this is something that MacArthur simply got wrong. And this is something that he didn't know. And so I mentioned the testimony that he gave. He talked about how the United States could handle all this stuff. And the testimony was covered wall to wall. So in all the major newspapers, the testimony was repeated. The sessions were held in executive session, so there were no reporters present, but a transcript was given out by the stenographer that the Congress hired. And then it was published, and it would be 3, 4, 5 full pages of newspaper, for days and days after this. And it riveted the attention of the country. But it wasn't all the testimony. It was 99.5% of the testimony, but there was a little bit that was held back. And what was held back was something that even MacArthur himself didn't know. And that was American military forces of all kinds, soldiers, planes, ships, were stretched very thin. And it's an important thing to remember here now that the United States rapidly demobilized after 1945. Until by 1947, the American military was a shadow of what it had been before. After the Soviet Union, after China went communist, after the Soviet Union developed an atom bomb, and then after the outbreak of the Korean War, then there's a reversal of thinking in Washington. We have to rearm, but you can't do that overnight. And so by the autumn of 1950, America was on track to rebuild the military, but it hadn't been rebuilt yet. And so the testimony given to Congress, MacArthur gave his testimony for 3 days and then he left. And then the Air Chief of Staff, the Chief of Naval Operations, the Army Chief of Staff, they come in and they testify. And one after the other they say, we cannot fight a two-front war at this point. We are stretched as thin as we can be. MacArthur was operating on the assumption, okay, we're fighting in East Asia. Yeah, maybe the Soviet Union attacks in Europe, but Eisenhower and NATO can handle that. But in fact, there simply weren't enough troops. There weren't enough planes. There weren't enough ships, tanks, and all the other stuff to fight both wars. MacArthur did not realize that. Truman knew it full well. So Truman knew that a choice had to be made. Do we defend Europe or do we defend East Asia? MacArthur was operating on the belief we didn't have to make a choice. Yeah. We could do both the way we did in World War II. But in World War II, there were 16 million Americans under arms. Yeah. And at this point, there were less than 1 million American under arms. So it's an entirely different thing. Yeah. You know, 3 years down the road, maybe, but that's not now. And so it's this fundamental difference of assumptions and of knowledge that drives the different views. And so while MacArthur is welcoming the opportunity to expand the war and not worrying about the fact that it might bring in the Soviet Union, Truman is doing everything he can to contain the war in East Asia, because he figured that if the war in East Asia gets bigger, the Soviet Union is going to attack, but it won't attack in East Asia. It'll jump West Berlin. Yep. And so it'll hit us in Europe, which is the more important. So we've got these two different objectives that are fighting against each other. Now, neither side is coming out openly saying what their concerns are, what their objectives are. MacArthur is not saying, I welcome World War III. Right. He already had a reputation as a warmonger, and he wouldn't go that far. Truman is not going to say, we can't fight a two-front war, because that would invite the Soviet Union to encourage escalation in East Asia and then jump West Germany at the same time. So, and the public isn't aware of this underlying difference. It's getting a sense that there are different objectives, but depending on which party you're in, whether you're in Truman's Democratic Party or the Republicans, depending on who you think makes more sense, Truman or MacArthur, people are lining up as in. So while Truman is trying to tamp down the war in East Asia, his political opponents saying that he's weak, that he's not dealing with communism. On the other hand, people who think that Truman has the correct way of looking at it, think of MacArthur as this raving warmonger who's going to risk nuclear war and killing us all. Yep. And there's an element of truth in both of those things that are saying. And Truman is reluctant to push this issue to the moment of crisis, in part because he knows there's going to be a firestorm if he does fire MacArthur. Yeah. Meanwhile, MacArthur is feeding damaging information to Truman's political opponents back in the United States. He's writing these letters to Republican leaders in Congress who are using the letters with intelligence about the war against Truman until finally Truman in the late winter, early spring of 1951 concludes, I gotta fire this guy. Now, I have to be clear, by firing, all he's doing is saying he's no longer in command of American forces in East Asia. He can't fire, he's still a five-star general. He's still got all this seniority, he's got all this, but he's just being relieved of that particular assignment. But it was a big deal. And by the time it happened, it seems apparent that MacArthur was expecting it to happen. He certainly hadn't backtracked on anything. If anything else, he'd been doubling down on the difference between himself and Truman. And there's reason to believe that once it went beyond a certain point, MacArthur had concluded, I'm going to get fired, so I'm going to do it on my own terms. And furthermore, he had decided he's finally going to come back to the United States and he's going to run for president. So I'm going to run for Truman, saying that Truman is weak against communism. And Truman fired this guy, me, who knows more about how to deal with the communists than anybody else. So put the burden on Truman instead of resigning or something like that. Now, in American politics, you don't get any mileage out of resignations. It's news for a day, but then it goes away. No, better to be fired. You know, a good firing is better than a sorry resigning. And so that's what it comes to. And in fact, it begins to play out exactly as MacArthur thought. So he is invited back to the United States. He's given, now this is so a general who has been relieved of his command gets a ticker tape parade in New York City. He's this mythic figure. Now, part of it is the fact that MacArthur had never received his hero's welcome at the end of World War II because had never come back to the United States. So some of this is belated, but some of it is people say that, well, yeah, we like you better than we like Truman. And in fact, public opinion polls at the time showed that Truman's approval rating hit an all-time low, even until today, of approval for a president, lower than Richard Nixon in the depths of the Watergate scandal. So 22% of Americans, only 20% of Americans approved of Truman's handling of things.
Wow. And
so it really looked as though MacArthur had won this face-off between the two. But turned out, though, that that advantage faded because when Americans stepped back, they realized, MacArthur was really treading on dicey constitutional grounds here. And one of the glories of the American system is that our elected civilian leaders make the final decisions. We don't subcontract that to generals who are not responsible to anybody. And so there were a lot of people who said, okay, MacArthur might have been right on the policy recommendations, but he was wrong to flout the policy of the president of the United States. Now, to MacArthur's credit, he never disputed the authority of Truman to relieve him of command. He thought it was stupid, but he didn't think it was wrong or unconstitutional.
That was fantastic. I want to get to some of our audience questions.
Yeah.
Just because we're running low on time here.
Okay.
So Driz Larafi asks basically, so MacArthur's plan to use an atomic bomb against China to finish the Korean War. So basically this question is, did the reason that Truman refused this plan, was that because it was strategically not smart or because it was morally wrong? I guess that's hard to know, to get into Truman's mind and heart to know.
I would say that for a president who had used 2 atom bombs strategically, that is against cities where the principal targets are civilian, to deny MacArthur the use of tactical nuclear weapons, small nuclear weapons against military targets. No, I don't think the decision was on moral grounds. It was really on strategic and political grounds. And the ultimate strategic consideration was, will this force Soviet entry into the war? Because if the Soviet Union joins the war, it wouldn't be just the war in Korea. It would be a war against the United States. Right. And it might lead to a Soviet attack in Western Europe, which is what Truman was really worried about. So it was really a concern with what this would do to the global strategic situation.
Excellent. Albert Goldson asks, to what extent were the Chinese aware of these tensions and did they try to exploit them? And I could just add, while you think about that the Chinese were very keen students of MacArthur and did know about his tendencies, his tactics, his prerogatives, and had predicted that he might land, do a dazzling amphibious landing somewhere like Incheon, and had relayed that to Kim Il-sung, but Kim Il-sung was in no position to do anything about it or disregarded the information. But to the extent they knew about the tensions between the president and the leader, and MacArthur, you address this in your book, how you were saying that the Chinese might have thought that it was a deliberate ploy to have the president saying one thing and the general saying another thing.
Yeah, well, so in fact, in a system like that of communist China, generals do not speak out of turn. They're all members in good standing of the Communist Party. And if they ever think about speaking out of turn, they quickly get relieved. So it would be really difficult for somebody who is immersed in that kind of situation to imagine that a general could say things so at variance with what the president of the United States wanted to happen, because nothing like it could happen in the Chinese system. So it was very much more likely that they did think that this was a deliberate ploy. We're going to say one thing, the right hand's going to do one thing and the left hand's going to do something else. I should point out that for the Chinese, the fate of North Korea was not a big deal. The whole question was, are we going to have to fight again with Chiang Kai-shek? Yeah. And of course, if the United States got involved in a general war with China, one that was not simply confined to the northern part of Korea, then Chiang Kai-shek would have been involved. And At the beginning of the Korean War, Harry Truman ordered the 7th Fleet to start cruising in the Taiwan Strait. And for public consumption, this was to prevent the Chinese communists from having any ideas about attacking Taiwan. In reality, it was to prevent Chiang Kai-shek from getting any ideas about reopening the Chinese Civil War. And so the Truman administration wanted above all to keep Chiang Kai-shek out of this whole thing, because Truman knew, and was really aware in the context of American politics, that there was this hardcore bloc within the Republican Party that loved Chiang Kai-shek and would do almost anything to get him back into the war. And the Republicans in Congress kept saying, unleash Chiang Kai-shek, or at least let him send troops to Korea, or better yet, let him send troops right across the Taiwan Strait and open a second front against China. But Truman didn't want anything to do with that.
I want to acknowledge questions from Jeffrey Tao and Gus Olson. I think we kind of addressed what they're asking about. Unfortunately, for time reasons, we don't have time to get to them. I want to leave you with one more question, Professor Brands, which is just kind of the look back. What are the lessons here? What have we learned? What are the takeaways from this episode in history?
I mentioned that Harry Truman was very unpopular following his decision to relieve MacArthur of command. His public opinion rating was 22%. It was the lowest in the history of these opinion polls about presidents. And it remained really low through the 1950s. It started to climb a little bit in the 1960s. Presidents always look a little bit better after they've been out of office for a while. Harry Truman, he was kind of revered as this old cranky but plain speaking guy. And so his approval rating went up, but it really went up. It strikingly went up in the 1980s, partly as South Korea emerged into this sort of model citizen of the world, but it really blew up. I mean, really rocketed Truman to the ranks of the almost greatest presidents around 1990. And what happened then? The Cold War ended. The Cold War ended essentially on Truman's terms. Truman was the one who established the idea that the United States can win the Cold War without having to fight World War III. And that's what the containment policy was all about. But it was a long-term policy, and it took that long for history events to prove that Truman was right. So, in fact, if the United States had followed MacArthur's path, saying World War III has begun, there quite likely would have been a World War III. It would have been between the United States, one nuclear power, and the Soviet Union, another nuclear power. And there's no telling what it would have done to Korea, to East Asia, to the rest of the world. That didn't happen. And yet the United States actually defeated communism, defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So I would say that the lesson from this is there are some wise policies that only prove to be wise over a long period of time. And the containment policy was one that was politically costly to somebody like Truman, because politics measures things in short terms. Every 2 years you get reelected to Congress and so on. But this is one that took 40 years to play out. And eventually, history showed that Truman was right on this one. MacArthur was wrong. But it took that long. So what does that mean for today? Well, now you're talking to a historian, so I can tell you what the past means. I don't try to predict the future. However, I will just point out that it's a reminder that for a country like the United States that interprets its interests globally, that has allies and potential rivals, enemies all around the world, there are decisions that have to be made. You can't do everything. And MacArthur was operating on the principle that the United States could do everything. Truman knew that the United States could not do everything. Even today, we have to recognize that. And again, I mentioned this earlier. Does the United States want to get more deeply involved in Europe at a time when China is increasingly competitive in East Asia? It's a decision we have to make now. It's probably a decision we're going to be making for the next 20 years.
Excellent. The General versus the President is the book. Professor Henry Brands is the author and our guest today. Thank you so much. This was excellent. Right about now, if you were in person, you would be hearing lots of applause. So please feel the applause, because you really did a wonderful job. And we're so grateful that you joined us today. To our audience members, thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate you. Please come back. Check out our programs at www.koreasociety.org. Got plenty more down the pipeline, and a lot more for the 70th anniversary of both the Alliance and the Armistice Agreement that brought the fighting of the Korean War to a close. So stay tuned for more programming like this in the near future. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Bye.